What is possibly the most controversial and maybe interesting argument for God's existence, even among theists? We're going to get to that here in a minute. We are looking at a book written by Ken Samples of Reasons to Believe, called Classic Christian Thinkers and Introduction. There are 9 thinkers we're going through, and we have looked at a few already, namely Irenaeus, Athanasius, and Augustine. Today we are going to look at Anselm, who has given us some very interesting and long-lasting issues in theology. Then we'll have to look forward to Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Blaise Pascal, and C.S. Lewis. So what is Anselm known for? Well, he lived from 1033 to 1109. He was a monk and has written many important works that we still study today in seminary and philosophers still study. And those are the Monologion, the Proslogion, Cur Deus Homo. These works are where we can find Anselm's arguments for God's existence. The Cur Deus Homo is a work where he talks about, it means that's Latin for why the God-man, and that'll play into his satisfaction theory, which I'll get to in a little while. His argument for God, he makes one of the most controversial yet interesting arguments for God out there, and it's even debated among theists as to whether it is, of course, a lot of these are debated among theists, but whether or not it is sound or not. We'll get to what the argument is momentarily. Out of this kind of thinking, this kind of ontological thinking, we get perfect being theology. So perfect being theology is a notion of more of an a priori, and the ontological argument is more of an a priori argument, which supposedly, rather than looking at experience, it looks more just from reason alone and asks the question, what can we know about God? And so perfect being theology is more of the notion of it's better for God to have quality X, therefore, as a perfect being, he must have quality X, like omniscience or omnipotence or whatever. Well, let's look. I'm going to primarily look today at his theological contributions. I'm not going over a lot of the biographical material that the book has. I want you to get the book, read it, but I'm going to focus on the theological import these guys bring to the table. And for Anselm, if you hear the word Anselm, we always think of this argument right here, which is the ontological argument. It is called that from the Greek word ontos, which means being. So ontology, not to be confused with oncology, which is the study of cancer. Ontology with a T is the study of being or existence. Sometimes that's synonymously used with metaphysics nowadays in philosophy, but the ontological argument is an argument for God's existence based on just the notion of being, and it goes like this. This is phrased a little bit different from the book, I think, but this is a basic gist of it. God is a being that which none greater can be conceived. Okay, so the argument here, the notion here is that you cannot think of any being greater than God. And what he's trying to do with this argument is try to show just from reason alone. He was asked by his fellow monks, can you give us an argument for God's existence that's not based on the scriptures that will be useful for talking to non-believers, and we can just know from reason alone. And Anselm thought, well, even the fool in his heart believes that he knows what he's talking about with God, that God is a being that which none greater can be conceived. That's the basic definition that Anselm maintains here for God's existence, for what he is. So, and I think most people would agree with that God is a being that which none greater can be, because you can't conceive of anything greater than God if God were an existing being. Because if you could think of a being that was greater than God, then he wouldn't be God. So the second premise of this argument is it is better to exist in reality than just in the mind. What he's saying here is that it's better for God to exist in the actual order of existence, not simply in my mind. And we can think of all kinds of things that just exist in our minds. Things like Snoopy, not just a cartoon on paper, but characters that don't really exist per se, leprechauns and unicorns, and if you believe in those things, then fine. But most of us don't believe in those things. Those are more of what philosophers call beings of reason, or they just exist in the mind. So it would be better, Anselm says, if God existed not simply in our minds, but in reality as well. Because it's better to exist, Anselm says, than not to exist, basically. So the property of existence for Anselm is such that it's better to have it than not have it, kind of like his perfect being theology would dictate. And so he says, if you could conceive of a being that exists outside the mind, then that would be a better being than existed simply in the mind. So if God did exist just in the mind, we could conceive of a being outside the mind that was greater. And this is the linchpin for this argument, that Anselm says that would mean that God is the greatest conceivable being if he's in the mind, but he's not the greatest conceivable being because we could conceive of one outside the mind. So to avoid a contradiction, Anselm says that we can't say God is both the greatest and not the greatest conceivable being that there is. So if he's just in the mind, then there could be something greater than him, which would be a being outside the mind. And so for Anselm to avoid that contradiction, it must follow that God does in fact exist in reality. He doesn't just exist in the mind. And that is the linchpin of this way of thinking. It's this kind of argumentum ad absurdum way, argument to absurdity, that if you maintain that God is the greatest conceivable being, then he must exist in reality, because he can't be the greatest conceivable being in the mind only, because you can conceive of a being greater than that outside the mind. Okay, well, this has split theists in various camps, either thinking that this is a good argument, it's not a good argument. Thomas Aquinas, for example, would argue that, well, that really assumes you know what the nature of God is. We can't know the nature of God in that regard, so it's not really a sound argument. And he also said that, well, he might be self-evident in himself, that is God, but not be self-evident to us. So a thing can be self-evident in itself, but not necessarily to the one who's thinking about it. So he agreed with Anselm that, yeah, God just does exist, in a sense, per what we know about him. But we can't use that as a definition of nature right off the bat without arguing back to it from creation. And so both Anselm and Aquinas thinks that God's being is just simply to exist, but they get there in very radically different ways. So Anselm gets there by just defining God that way, and Aquinas gets there from looking at the reality, universe, nature around us, and then reasoning back from the effect of the world to the cause of that world and the effect. So he doesn't think it's sound. We do see this kind of raised back with Descartes, who's a modern father of modern philosophy. Immanuel Kant, for example, says that we can't talk about existence as a predicate. And I think we could agree with him on that existence is not anything you add to something. It's just something in and of itself that's just there. So he rejects it. But there are many thinkers today who endorse the ontological argument, and many who don't. Alvin Plantinga has made it popular again with his famous modal version of the ontological argument. I'm going to that here, but he kind of revamped it in modern analytic philosophical terms. Interestingly, Plantinga is not saying that this proves God exists beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it makes our belief in God rational and respectable, basically. So that's his basic. I would say that is Anselm's greatest contribution to theology, is this ontological argument. I personally don't think it's successful. I would agree with Aquinas that we can't just define God in that way. That's confusing the order of knowing and the order of being. We can't start with the order of knowing and then get to the order of being that way. There was a monk lived around contemporaneously with Anselm, named Gonillo, and he tried to argue against Anselm's argument by arguing for an island in the same fashion that Anselm argued for God. And Gonillo said, well, I can imagine a perfect island, and a perfect island must exist in reality, not just in the mind, therefore this island must exist. And so Anselm came back, and I think with a better clarity and a better way of discussing it, says, well, an island is not a necessary being. God is a necessary being, therefore you can't just posit an island like you can posit God, because God must exist necessarily if he were to exist at all. I think he's right on that point. We also could question the notion of what a perfect island would be. This is very analogous to what we hear in discussions of the problem of evil, and asking the question of, well, is this the best possible world, or does that even make any sense? What does it mean to be the best possible world? Is that even coherent? So Anselm, I think he does a good job responding to Gonillo. I don't think that the argument overall is amazingly successful. This is an a priori argument, meaning that it is meant to start with just the mind alone, supposedly. I think we probably can make an argument that it does import things from reality, like existence and things that you can't just, if you were born, well, you have to experience. I think you have to get our knowledge ultimately from our experience of reality. But the other arguments for God's existence, like the cosmological ones, teleological design arguments, moral arguments, are seen more as a posteriori, meaning that they're based on experience or known after experience in some way, and reasons back from effects to the cause. This is where we get this perfect being theology from. Those, if you define God as this perfect being, then it would seem to follow that it's better for God to have certain qualities like omniscience, omnipotence. Many would say perfect goodness, and whatever you want, omnipresence. Better for God to have quality X than not have it. Therefore, he must have it. This is perfect being theology, and this is what comes out of this kind of Anselmian ontological view of what God is. We also, I mentioned, but he is famous for his satisfaction theory, and that is the notion that we as humans owe a debt to an infinite God, so we owe a debt that we cannot pay. And so, cur Deus homo, why the God-man, is the answer to that. The God-man exists to pay our debt. And so Jesus came in the flesh to pay a debt that only we owed, but only he could pay. So why the God-man was because to bridge the gap between God and man, to satisfy that debt that we paid, that we owed, rather, that we can't pay. And so Jesus, as the God-man, was able to pay that debt on our behalf. And so satisfaction theory is one of the well-known theories of atonement throughout church history. It's very similar to things like substitutionary atonement theory, where Christ stood in our place, and because of his substitutionary atonement for us, and that does satisfy God. So there's some similarities there with substitutionary view. So Anselm is a very well-known thinker. He's very popular in apologetics and theology and philosophy. So be aware of him. If you haven't got the book yet, go get the book, read the chapters we've already gone over, and watch the videos. It's a good book. Ken is a great guy. RTB is a great organization. I'm happy that I can be part of it as a visiting scholar. So make a comment, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff, and we'll see you next time.